it's him going back through old mixtapes, talking about like just some mixtapes in general.
Right.
But also it's like a cathartic, like him reliving
I might
their
have to read it
relationship.
because we still have it, I think. So anyway, let's get down to business.
Mm-hmm.
So this is me with Bond here. Actually, we are in snowy western Pennsylvania right now, which is kind of our home area, western central Pennsylvania, and a lot of the towns around us really got their start during the oil boom days, which starting really in August of 1859 when Colonel Drake struck well just outside of Titusville in Crawford County, Venango County area. A whole industry was born practically overnight. A lot of these towns, such as Evans City, right by us, is really exists in its entirety because of oil. Now, a lot of these towns, as you could imagine, like Oil City and Franklin, are still around, but just as many others kind of fell by the wayside as the boom went bust. And one of those is just north of Oil City is Petroleum Centre. Now, it might not be the most famous ghost town in Pennsylvania, nor the most famous ghost town of the oil era. I think that would probably lay at the feet of Pithole City. Either way, Petroleum Centre really only existed from about 1861 to 1873, and today it still has remnants, including an old farmhouse and an old farmhouse. There's a couple of small cemeteries as well, which remain.
Yeah, there's the cemeteries. They do have some replica. Oh, I'm not sure how much of it's replica and how much of it is.
Well, there are the steps leading into one of the banks, and there's a few dugout areas which were the foundation of the Opera House and a bunch of different shops, and some of the bricks which remain from the foundation of the company store. But despite its relatively short life, 7 to 8 years, depending on whether you judge it by the time it was chartered or by the time George Henry Bissell struck oil on his farm property in 1860, the farmland essentially making up most of what would be Petroleum Centre. Despite all of that, it has a lot of really interesting historical significance and historical firsts even.
Began roughly in like 1859, it really peaked in 1869 at about 5,000 residents. And then, within a few years, around 1873, is when it was really abandoned at that point.
And it had become abandoned for a variety of reasons. Not only because the oil production had kind of slowed down, not only because of a few significant fires, which Bond will get into maybe a little later, but also because the difficulty in transportation. Now, Oil Creek runs through the town. And what they would do is they would transport the oil on barges predominantly, and they would dam up Oil Creek, break the dams, and raft the oil down the flooded creek into Oil City.
Which may sound insane, and it kind of was. Like, when you look at, like, what these... Because, like, I'm sure a lot of you listeners have heard stories of, like, how they used to move logs down the rivers in Pennsylvania and a lot of other places, which sounds crazy, but that's what they did, and it was kind of the similar thing with these barges of oil.
And the Oil Creek itself, for anybody that's seen it and look up pictures of it, it looks like it's a lot deeper than it is. And there are sections that are fairly deep, but especially when you get closer to Oil City proper, it seldom gets much more than knee deep, and it's just not quite deep enough to be considered navigable, especially if you've got a few barges weighed down with heavy crude.
Exactly. And as far as how much they were producing, whenever it topped out about 1,000 barrels a day.
And that was around 1866,
1867. Yeah. So and there was about 1,000 barrels a day. And you're right, it kept that up for a few years. It wasn't like they hit one really good well and rode that out. There was a lot of really good wells.
And if you look at old photos of the town, because there's a lot of really great photos of the downtown area, but as soon as you're off the main drag, And on the hillsides, they are just acneed with hundreds of little wells all through the place.
Yeah, all over the place. And you're probably asking yourself, well, who was manning those wells? Well, the land, because the company owned everything, they leased the land that those wells were on to the individual prospectors. Now, what the company got was half the oil that came out of each one of those wells. So, even if the main company decided to not pump another gallon of oil, they were still racking it in, basically. So the town did also have kind of like an Old West kind of vibe that we think of nowadays. It being a company town, like we have lots of company towns around Pennsylvania. The whole East Coast does. And like you were saying earlier, Nick, with some of them survive, some of them don't. When you look at a lot of the ghost towns around Pennsylvania, a lot of them were company towns.
And they were either timber towns. They're predominantly timber towns or oil towns, because coal towns stick around because that usually
anything mining related. But you saw it with timber, especially. You have, I mean, if you think that Petroleum Centre wasn't around very long, you look at some of the timber towns, especially in like north central Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
they'd have 15,000 people living in them for 16 months. And then that was it, kind of thing.
And then most of those places, very few of the buildings from the original, when it was originally a company town, remained because they would break them down and
move them somewhere.
Yeah,
they move them. Yeah, exactly. They move them somewhere else.
But getting back to Petroleum Centre though.
But yeah, so like I said, the company owned everything, so they had eminent domain over everything that was built there. As a result, everything wasn't built to last. There's a reason why we don't have too many of the structures, and those structures that were solidly built were moved after the fact.
Yeah, my understanding is some of them were moved to, there's a town just north of Oil City, right between Oil City and Petroleum Centre, and my understanding is quite a few of the buildings.
In like Rouseville?
Rouseville.
Okay, yeah, that would make sense. I didn't see that, but that would totally make sense because you're not going to ship everything the whole way down to Clarion at that point.
Right.
So,
in my understanding, most of my knowledge comes from I read about one book that talks a lot about Petroleum Centre, but right now the Oil Creek and Titusville Railroad, which is the last railroad, has a post office on the train itself.
Yep.
They run through, they do a historical tour, and the train station, which is not the original train station, which had burnt down, is my understanding, but the train station that's there in Petroleum Centre has a really good historical exhibit there, and just it's really a font of information.
Oh yeah, that train ride's, because you guys have been on that, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, if anyone gets a chance, it's worth it.
Particularly in the autumn. And one thing I'll say real quick, because I know you got more to add, but we talked about some of the first, and actually the term wildcatter, which probably isn't as used as often in today's parlance, but the term wildcatter originates in Petroleum Centre. As you come into Petroleum Centre from Route, is it 62 or?
Well, that's still 8 right there.
Yeah, you're correct. Yeah. 62 comes up on the other
after,
side of it.
But
if you're traveling Route 8 and you come into Petroleum Centre, you'll pass through a hollow known as Wildcat Hollow. And the term wildcatter applies to risky investors, or more at the time, risky oil prospectors. And so that Wildcat Hollow.
So the funny thing is, I saw conflicting information online, as can be expected. So I always figured Wildcatter, like Wildcatters, Wildcat Hollow, I knew that connection.
Yes.
I figured it was because there was just like a bunch of mountain lions in the area. That may have been true, but apparently there was one particularly mean and rough oil prospector who had a stuffed puma that he put on top of his Drake. And
I've heard that. Yeah.
And it's one of those things where like, it's almost one of those things where it's just weird enough that I'm like, I don't know if they would have made that up. Like, it's because it's such a strange thing to, like, because I don't know.
But what came first?
Exactly. Yeah. Was it?
That's
yeah.
Curious. You know what? I had heard that, but I had not heard that in connection with
wildcatter. Exactly. Yeah. So I don't know, because I've heard that it, again, like you said, that it did originate there. But you got to wonder, like, which came first.
Was from a historical plaque which I had read, the Wildcat Hollow. So
yeah,
I'm gonna side with that. But even a lot of those blue Pennsylvania plaques sometimes are, not the most accurate.
Yeah, they have not always been proofread by everybody. But getting back to some of the stats about the town, just to give you guys more of an idea of what it was like back then. Like we said, everything was pretty hastily built, so it was a lot of like canvas, wood, a lot of even like mud structures in some places. But like apparently beds and housing were really hard to come across, so people would literally be like sharing beds and shifts.
Yeah.
Like whatever your 6 to 8 hours off shift was, you had a bed during that period of time if you paid for it, but the rest of the hours someone else had it, which is just like almost kind of crazy to think about. There was the doomed opera house that they had. There was dry goods stores, brothels, saloons.
When you say things like that, you talked about the Wild West image.
It kind of has that vibe. Except one of the things the Wild West had that Petroleum Centre didn't have was they didn't have company police. So there were county sheriffs and stuff like that theoretically back then, but there was no like Petroleum Centre police department. So you have all of these prospectors, some of them making tons of money, some of them losing it, plus brothels, places to gamble, places like that, and
crazy historical villains like Ben Hogan.
Yes, like Ben Hogan.
To talk about sometime in the near future.
Yeah, exactly. People like that. And so you can imagine, like, there with no law, things were pretty kind of, it was just a really unsafe place. And then on top of that, to make it even more unpleasant, there wasn't really any like public service. So that means like no real streets, no public works, no sanitation. So you have these muddy streets, just human waste everywhere, and when it got wet and dirty and muddy and everything, it stayed that way.
And a lot of these towns like popped up overnight. Like we mentioned Pit Hole earlier.
Yeah.
The city of Pit Hole had a 3-story hotel built in 3 days. That's one of those figures that really sticks with me. And so a lot of this, like, they had paper streets lined out, but there wasn't really a whole mess of like city planning going on. So a lot of these towns were erected long before things like proper sanitation could be put in place. So pretty wild. And Petroleum Centre, I've heard of people, they put the railroad through. I believe the original railroad came in around late 1866. And back in that time, and really up until the early 20th century, train conductors and train staff would have smelting salts on person, because as people would come into towns, the stench was oftentimes so
overpowering. Yeah,
people would faint.
People would literally drop because it was just too much.
Yeah,
and it's like, and it's hard to imagine that. But the thing is, and I know that sounds kind of gross, but like we want to paint a picture for you of just like how rough this place was, and B, to think how good the oil was coming out of it,
to risk all of this.
That people were doing this willingly.
Well, and so you talked about the danger. Like, there's no police, there's no real it's dangerous hygienically. It's dangerous because you got a lot of rough people coming on. But then a lot of the oil was stored in open containers. Which kind of led to a number of fires. But also, they would know smoking signs everywhere, which were openly. Because who's going to come down on you for smoking?
Yep.
But I do know in 1871, President Ulysses S. Grant, who had his hunting grounds not too far away, came in by way of the train and visited Petroleum Centre, and I believe it wasn't that long thereafter that the hotel he stayed in caught on fire and burnt down when embers from the train.
Yep. from the train of all things. Yeah.
Caught with some oil and set the hotel on fire.
Yeah. Who knew the hotel built in 3 days?
Well, that was
maybe.
Different hotel,
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But
honestly,
everything.
The one in Petroleum Centre wasn't built that much.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So like it's like when things burned down, it was just like, welp, that was to be expected.
Yeah.
You know. So
keep moving.
Yeah. But yes, I mean, hopefully that paints like a picture of what this place was at its height. And like you said, Nick, there was the large hotel fire.
Yeah.
That didn't necessarily signal the downfall, but it was like that's what people use as a marker of saying like, hey, here's when things started to peter out.
Yeah, and funny enough, I do want to mention a couple of other things real quick, but the newspaper in Pithole burnt down because of a similar fire. Like, so when they burnt down, the Pithole newspaper moved to Petroleum Centre, which already had its own paper.
Yeah.
The big name in Petroleum Centre there was the Bissells.
Yeah.
Because George Henry Bissell, it was his farm. I believe parts of the farm are still standing, but he was the one that struck oil in 1860 on his property and set everything into motion. I believe the Bissell family cemetery, I believe that's one of the cemeteries that's still around. It's kind of walled in. And then there's another cemetery just north. If you visit the town today, you can visit the cemeteries and you can see, like I had mentioned before, some of the foundations of these buildings and the steps from one of the banks.
Cool. Yeah.
They have a really great historic site there with a lot of photos and everything. But one of the members of the U.S. House of Representatives from Pennsylvania, James Francis Burke, he served in the U.S. House of Representatives 1905 to 1915. He was actually born in Petroleum Centre in 1867. And other than the Bissell name, his name might be one of the more famous ones associated with the area, other than like knowing that John Wilkes Booth had lived not that far away, the Vanderbilts were in the region.
Yeah,
There's a lot of really famous names that we associate today with Old Wealth that were, if not operating immediately in Petroleum Centre, were very much aware and in the region. And it's just a really interesting thing. And as you walk through the ghost town, I think that's part of the thing that has appeal for us, is to walk through this desolate forest essentially and look around and understand like this was once a bustle.
Yeah.
And if only we could look at it with like these special lenses on and see what it could have been. It's really remarkable to look at these photos, and you can stand on these two steps from the old bank and look at this photo, and you can see those very steps you're standing on 150 years removed. And it really does boggle the mind. And one of the things that always gets me though, looking at these foundations, they look so small, and then you look at the photos, and the buildings look so big.
Yeah, no, you're right. The fact that it's a weird perspective to have on things, because we kind of like think of like our modern homes and what our shops. Yeah. Like we think of how big a shopping mall is compared to like what their general store would have been.
Right.
You know?
So anyway, that's one of those things. The outlines of buildings always appear to be too small to house the actual building. But anyhow, that's Petroleum Centre. Again, the town really was put on the map in 1866, but I like to go back to when Bissell struck oil, because that's when everybody started pouring in. So Petroleum Centre, I'm going to say 1860 to 1863.